So the paper I'm going to present today is IGC funded research, so we're very grateful for the IGC for supporting this research agenda. The broad aims of the agenda are to understand how management practices in public bureaucracies relate to the quality and quantity of public services that are provided. The paper I'm going to present is joint work with a PhD student of mine at UCL, Dan Rogger. Dan's now going to be moving to the World Bank, where he's going to be continuing this agenda, which more broadly will try to understand the causes and consequences of how bureaucrats are managed on public service delivery. So the effectiveness of government bureaucracy matters for a whole variety of different reasons. From a macro perspective, we think of a large share of economic activity as arising from the public sector. And as has been argued in the state capabilities literature, the quality of the bureaucracy is an important determinant of growth. The sectors in which the state tends to predominantly be focused on have big implications for societal welfare as well as levels of inequality. And from a micro perspective, we often think that a lot of the policy evaluations we conduct, if we find interventions that are welfare enhancing, then with some caveats, those can be scaled up effectively by bureaucracies or other government agencies nationwide. But in order to understand what's actually driving the effectiveness of government bureaucracies, our approach is to try to understand one particular dimension of that relationship, which is the management practices that bureaucrats are operating under. Methodologically, we're going to follow an approach quite similar to that's been pioneered in the work of Nick Bloom and John Van Reenen's work, which has tried to measure management practices in private sector contexts. We're going to take their essential design of their survey and then tailor that to the context of a public bureaucracy in a developing country, where we're going to take insights both from the economics literature as well as from the literature in public administration to understand what might be the most important margins of management practice for bureaucrats. So what we're going to observe in our data set is 63 organizations within the Nigerian civil service. Some of those will correspond to government ministries, others will correspond to more decentralized federal agencies. In each of these agencies, we will measure management practices and we'll measure them along three distinct dimensions. One is the extent to which bureaucrats are provided autonomy over decision making, and the extent to which they have flexible decision making in terms of day-to-day decisions and how they turn plans for projects into actual outcomes for those public projects. Second dimension we'll be trying to measure is the provision of incentives and the degree to which bureaucrats are monitored within public sector organizations. And then the third dimension will be a composite of other indices related to how well trained the staff are and some notions of culture within the organization. The projects that we're going to be studying are assigned to each of the 63 civil service organizations centrally through the National Assembly of the Parliament in Nigeria. These projects, of which there are about 4,500 in our data set, are of 11 different types. The majority of these projects are construction projects such as roads, boreholes, which are a type of well, and buildings, and there are some non-construction projects such as training, procurement projects as well that comprise the remaining quarter of projects that we observe being implemented by these 63 organizations. What we're going to observe though is two interesting features that we'll exploit. First of all, we're going to observe the same type of project being implemented by many different organizations. So for example, one type of project will have a small-scale dams, and we'll see these being constructed by federal ministries of water, agriculture, the environment, and by all the various river basin development authorities that are also included within our 63 civil service organizations. The other key dimension to bear in mind is that we're going to observe the same organization being tasked to implement multiple different types of project. So the Ministry of Water will be constructing both these dams, but it will also be charged with conducting some training projects as well as constructing some roads and so on and so forth. What we're essentially going to be trying to do is to say management practices as measured at the level of the organization, how do they correlate to the extent to which these types of projects are then being completed, and the quality with which they're being completed. To give you a sense of some of the important sources of variation in our data, Figure A shows for each of the 11 types of project in our data set the number of organizations that are implementing each type of project. So different colors here within each bar correspond to a different organization. So for boreholes, for example, which are the most numerous type of project that we observe in our data, we observe a large number of organizations implementing boreholes. So our data in terms of project outcomes comes from a unique period in Nigeria's history, and essentially comes from what was known as the Open Initiative. So let me give you a little bit of background to what drove this initiative and exactly what type of data was collected in terms of public services being delivered. So Nigeria began a series of sweeping reforms to its economy in the early 2000s, and as a result, the Paris Club cancelled its external debt by about 18 billion US dollars. The presidency of Nigeria then decided to reallocate what would have been the servicing of this debt towards the public sector and social sector, which is really the core focus of our work today. And so what they really saw was an opportunity to try and trace expenditures project by project, and try to measure accurately on a project by project basis the extent to which projects were actually being completed relative to what was originally prescribed in Parliament, and also to try to measure to some extent the quality with which those projects had been completed. So that's what was known as the Open Initiative, which started in 2006-07. And so that traced by project the use and impact of a random sample of about 10% of all federal government expenditures in the social sectors. We're going to focus on those projects that could have been completed within a 12-month completion schedule. And so 18 months after the project was initially designed by Parliament and allocated to the organisation, a team of independent engineers then show up and then try to measure the extent to which the project has been completed and the quality with which it's been completed. That'll give us our two main outcome measures, project by project, that we'll be focusing on today. One is going to be the project completion rate, which is a continuous measure running from 0 to 1 as coded by these independent engineers. A project completion rate of 1 indicates that a project was completed to exactly the technical specifications that were originally specified by the National Assembly for that project. And a project completion rate of 0 corresponds to no physical evidence being found by the engineers of the project ever having been started. That doesn't mean the organisation didn't attempt to start it, but there's no evidence that anything was actually gotten off the ground for that particular project. And then the engineers also coded more coarsely a measure of the quality of the service or public good provided, and that's just a 0-1 dummy variable for project quality. So why should we believe any of the data collected in public service delivery as part of the Open Initiative? Is it all credible? Well, the individuals who were conducting these evaluations were independent teams of engineers and members of civil society. They were not individuals who were in any way linked to the civil servants who actually were tasked to implement the projects originally. They went through a long training process to make sure that their procedures were standardized. And then there were various checks and balances put into place. So there were random audits conducted on the evaluators themselves, and it's been documented in other work that the audits they still may be measured with some error. But we think of these as being a good way to try to measure, at least in the context of the Open Initiative around this time, the extent to which public projects are being delivered. So in total, we have 63 organisations that are tasked to implement the 4,721 projects that are covered in the open data set. This corresponds to an aggregate budget of just around 800 million US dollars across all of these 4,000 projects. So Figure B then gives you an indication of project completion rates, just aggregating across all 11 different types of project as measured in the Open Initiative. So we observe that 38% of projects have a project completion rate of 0. More than 1 in 3 of these projects have never actually started, despite the existence of this Open Initiative, and about 30% of projects conditional on being started actually do end up being completed fully. So there's a wide degree of variation in the extent to which projects are being completed. Table 1 then gives a breakdown project type by project type in terms of the number of organizations that are implementing these projects. So here I want to highlight the wide degree of variation in projects being implemented by different organizations. So for example, 18 out of the 63 organizations in our data set are asked to construct boreholes, for example. And then we see that across project types, there's quite a lot of variation in the extent to which projects are not being started. So 44% of boreholes are never started. Only 12% of roads are never started. So there's lots of variation across project types. And then table 2 then focuses on the variation across our organizations, which is really the key variation that we want to sort of pin down. So this just shows you the 10 most important organizations in the Open Initiative, as measured by the number of projects being implemented by those organizations. So the Federal Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, they're responsible for 797 projects in our data set, and they're being tasked to implement 9 different types of project in the data set. So here we see this tremendous variation across these civil service organizations in the proportion of projects that never start. And so this could be down to a whole wide variety of factors that vary across organizations. We're going to try to focus in on one of those measures that varies across organizations, which are the management practices the civil servants are subject to within that organization. So there's been a revival of research trying to understand the causes and consequences of management practices in the context of private sector organizations. We're trying to apply that method and some of the insights given by that literature to the context of public bureaucracy. So we spent a long period of time working with senior civil servants in the Nigerian bureaucracy to try to tailor the Bloom Van Reenen style management survey to pick up what were really regarded to be the key dimensions of management practice in our specific context. Okay, so the Bloom Van Reenen management practice surveys essentially collect information related to 4 broad topics of management practice: operations, targets, incentives, and monitoring. Through our close and long collaboration with the Nigerian civil service, we decided to extend the survey to cover 9 different topics. And within each of these 9 different topics, there's a whole variety of questions that are then asked, and then we amalgamate within each of these topics to construct various indices. So we're going to construct an index that relates to the autonomy that bureaucrats have, and the second measure will be in relation to the incentives, the explicit incentives that bureaucrats are subject to, and then a composite measure of other indices. As these measures are just constructed from these individual series of questions, we're just going to convert each of these into a Z-score. So that has a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1, and so when the regression results come up a little bit later, we'll just be able to interpret the marginal effects as effect sizes. Just to give you an indication of the types of things that then comprise our core indices. So the autonomy index is comprised from topics of the roles of civil servants and the flexibility with which they have. So these are the questions that comprise that index. And in the lower part of the table, showing the same thing with regards to our measure of the explicit incentives that bureaucrats are subject to. So those split between those incentives that relate to the performance of bureaucrats, either rewards or punishments for good and bad performance, as well as the extent to which bureaucrats are being monitored and reviewed for their performance. And so our empirical specification is very straightforward. We have a cross-section of projects, and we're going to try to correlate project completion rates in those projects to the management practices in place in the organisation that's tasked to implement that project. So our unit of observation is going to be project I of project type J. Remember, we have 11 different types of project in our in the Open Initiative. That's implemented by organisation N, and we have 63 organisations in our data set. So our outcome measure is going to be the project completion rate. That's the continuous variable between 0 and 1, and we're going to see how that correlates to these 3 dimensions of management practices: autonomy, the provision of incentives to bureaucrats, as well as a composite of other indicators, other types of management practice. And then we're also going to condition on a series of project characteristics: the scale of the project, the complexity of the project as measured by engineers who've gone through each of the technical specifications for each of the 4,500 projects, as well as various other characteristics of the organisation, such as the number of bureaucrats who work there, their levels of education, and so on and so forth. And then we're also going to condition our project fixed effects. So we're really going to be trying to compare 2 projects of the same type, 2 roads of similar complexity with similar budgets, who just happen to be implemented by 2 different organisations. How do those organisations differ? They differ in the management practices that bureaucrats are subject to. So our coefficients of interest will be gamma 1 and gamma 2, the marginal impacts of these management practices along these 2 dimensions on project completion rates. Okay. Our basic results are then shown in table 3. Each column corresponds to a slightly different specification. I'm going to just focus on the results in column 4, which is really our baseline specification, once we control for a full set of project and organisational characteristics, as well as project type fixed effects. So uniformly across these specifications, we see that the provision of autonomy to bureaucrats significantly increases project completion rates, and across these specifications we see the provision of performance incentives and monitoring to bureaucrats significantly decreases project completion rates. To get a sense of the magnitude of these effects, these should be interpreted as effect sizes. So a 1 standard deviation change in the provision of autonomy increases project completion rates by 18%, and a 1 standard deviation increase in the provision of incentives and monitoring to bureaucrats would decrease project completion rates by about 14%. Those are relatively large effects, given that earlier on we showed that about 38% of projects have a project completion rate of 0 in this context. The next table then just highlights similar set of findings in the last column in terms of the quality of projects. Autonomy seems to be very beneficial for the quality of projects that are completed by bureaucrats. The provision of explicit monetary incentives and monitoring of bureaucrats seems to be negatively correlated to the quality of projects that are implemented. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, what we're finding is that giving bureaucrats more autonomy and flexibility, more decision-making rights in how to translate plans into action and outcomes is actually beneficial for these projects. It's not that it's not the case that providing bureaucrats with more autonomy is leading to worse outcomes, say because of more corruption being able to take place when bureaucrats are given more autonomy. The provision of incentives has a negative impact on project completion rates and project quality. This is very different than what's typically found in private sector settings for provision of incentives. So what might be going on here? Well, we think of the contracting environment in public bureaucracies as being very different to what we typically observe in private sector settings, and there might be 2 especially important margins that can drive this negative impact that we're finding, and is actually looked into much more detail in their paper as a whole. The first is that bureaucrats are often engaged with in multitasking activities, so they have to exert many different types of effort. You might want to broadly characterize those efforts as those related to the processes versus those related to actual production and output. And essentially, the provision of incentives and monitoring in our setting might be more focused in on process activities rather than productive activities. They may be encouraging bureaucrats to tick boxes to say that they've done things, but not incentivizing them to optimally allocate their effort to actual implementation. It might also be the case that the practices that we measure under our performance incentives and monitoring essentially pick up subjective performance evaluation. So that essentially says that we're not going to be able to numerically calculate or have a very clean metric of how well a bureaucrat is performing. Similar problems would exist for trying to measure the output of academics. And so when you have those kinds of subjective performance evaluations, and that's really what workers are being incentivized against, then workers often have a lot of incentives to engage in influence activities, to be friends with their boss, to have those types of biases rather than actually spending time engaging in productive activities. And that may be part of the negative effect that we're picking up. So it seems as if in the context of public bureaucracies, multitasking and subjective performance evaluation might be key to understand why the provision of explicit incentives may actually backfire in these settings, which is very different than what is typically found in private sector organizations. Changing management practices has a large impact. A one standard deviation adjustment in these incentives in the right direction would lead to a potentially 32% increase in project implementation rates. And that's a large effect given that 38% of projects are not started to begin with. And this research has wider implications for the movement towards the provision of incentives in public bureaucracies, or what's been described as the good governance agenda, that we really want to think jointly of the incentives that we should give to bureaucrats with information about the exact nature of tasks that they're conducting and the contracting environment they're subject to. It's not necessarily the case that taking good best practices or good practices that have worked in the private sector and just applying them blindly to the public sector would lead to necessarily beneficial outcomes. And so this paper just fits into a wider agenda. We've really tried to focus in on management practices for bureaucrats within the bureaucracy, but there's obviously many other channels that you'd want to consider, some of which part of ongoing research and other research funded by the IGC, such as who enters the public sector into the first place, what's the relationship between other forms of accountability of bureaucrats and public service provision, both top-down and grassroots monitoring has been studied. So there's a rich future agenda to try to study many of these topics in conjunction with each other.